let me just do a quick introduction to Third Eyesight. So this is unusual that I'm speaking at an event of event managers, but I think there are some learnings from our industry, our specific little industry that we can draw from, which would be relevant to this audience. So I talked about uncertainty, and that's the theme at the moment which is playing out not just in India. The economic uncertainty actually is playing out across the world. And it has been the case since 2008. In the last 6 years, much has changed and much has not. One of the things which hasn't changed is uncertainty, unpredictability. That's the environment in which we're all doing business, in which we're all living. Let's look at the Indian economy. This is a graph showing GDP growth rates year on year. And as you can see, while there is growth, it's a slightly choppy graph. Some years have been fantastic and some of the other years have been not, and this is about 11 years of growth. India is one of the economies which has at least shown growth every year for the last 11 years. There are many economies around the world which haven't shown growth. But GDP growth is only one part of the story. It actually tells an incomplete story. When you look at GDP and what GDP comprises of, it's different things. There is government spending, there's private investment, there's private consumption, there is exports, netting out after imports. And you'll see one thing which is common in this graph, and that's private consumption. The proportion that private consumption actually contributes to GDP in absolute terms, or even as a proportion, is significant every year. In the years where private investment has actually been low, or even government investment has been low, it is private consumption which has driven the economy. So it's a very important component of the economic engine. In some years, let's say if you take 2012, for instance, as it shows in the graph, you can see the other components, they're virtually absent. And it's private consumption which is really driving. The problem is, when you have an uncertain economy, business people and the government are the quickest to cut back on investment, which are significant proportions of the GDP. We as private citizens still have to lead our lives. We will still spend. We may spend less, but we will still spend. And that's an important component that does drive GDP. And as long as that is there, we can look forward to growth happening on a year-on-year basis. So this is what the graph looks like since the mid-90s for private consumption. It's grown eightfold since the mid-90s. And that's significant. That's what we are seeing, and that's what all of us who are engaged in B2B businesses or B2C businesses are looking forward to and building our business plans on. If you look at some of the other countries, and obviously this is not an exhaustive list, I've just picked 4 or 5 other examples apart from India. I'd like to point out 2 things. Obviously, China's way ahead. There's one country which is missing on this graph, the United States of America. That's by far the largest private consumption market in the world. If I put the USA, everything else looks flat. So I've purposely left the USA out of this graph. But if you look at the rest of the markets, China is actually the 2nd largest, Germany is the 3rd largest after the US, and then UK and France are neck to neck, and then you have India. If you look at the growth trend, I'd like to just compare China and India. China opened up its economy in the late 70s, early 80s. The growth remained relatively flat because it was investment-led, export-led. Private consumption growth actually remained relatively flat for about 10 years. And it was only in the early 90s that private consumption growth actually started picking up. You'll see that growth picking up there. The next thing you'll notice is India picks up about 10 years after that. And if you remember, everybody knows that there was a significant policy change which happened in the early 90s in India, which led to a lot of investment, which led to a lot of business growth, and that spread a little bit of economic well-being around the country across consumers and private citizens, and that then has started getting pumped back into the economy as private consumption. So there is a lag between policy, private investment, government investment, and private consumption. And it's an important factor to keep in mind. We should be looking at consumption-led GDP growth. This is a useful reminder that Consumption can drive, consumption can sustain growth, but the pump needs to be primed by policy and by B2B investments. Once the pump is primed, we as consumers can take over, but there is a 5 to 10 year lag that we've got to keep in mind before that can happen. We talk about GDP growth as if all of that GDP translates into spending, and it doesn't, obviously. I mean, I can't pocket the GDP that the government talks about. I certainly pocket the income. Within income, there are different chunks that we lose out when we're looking at consumption-led growth as well. First of all, taxes. Nobody likes them, except for our income tax department, which has got more and more capable year on year in collecting, identifying sources of taxes. The second chunk is essentials, the regular stuff: food, clothing, housing, fuel, that kind of stuff. And it's a fairly big chunk. This graph is not representative of the country on average. It's just a representative graph for different segments. If you are oriented to saving for the future, there is one chunk which you set aside for savings. Most of us, when we are younger, tend not to save. We tend to spend first, and then whatever's left over gets saved. But as you grow older, you start to save more. And that's another chunk which goes out before the last chunk, which is important, which is the discretionary spend or the discretionary income. It is the discretionary income which drives a lot of the forward-looking growth of the economy. So when we're looking at, when people talk about consumption-led growth is not led by the essentials. Consumption-led growth is not really led by the savings, obviously, or by the taxes for that matter. It is led by discretionary spending. It is led by that spending which comes from when you're feeling confident about the future. If you break it apart, there are certain external factors which impact how we spend. All of us know this intuitively, and I thought it would be useful to remind ourselves in the context of our business environment. Number one, inflation. Costs have gone up significantly in the last few years. If you look at India, inflation touches double digits routinely. And when my colleagues or business associates overseas, when we are doing business plans and when we are doing business strategy for our clients, when we build in salary increments in the business plan which are in double digits, people are shocked. But then when we talk about inflation rates, it starts to make sense. Inflation rates of 10%, 12%, which impact essentials particularly, are hugely worrying. So what happens when inflation hits highs? Your essential spending goes up, obviously. But the discretionary spending does come down. And if you're not careful or if you don't have enough money, then your savings come down as well. In the case of an economic downturn hitting my income, everything goes down, including the essentials. So that obviously has a much bigger impact on the economy and the GDP growth at large, because essentials are a very, very large chunk of the spending and the GDP. Most importantly, when sentiments are negative, as they are right now, as they have been for some time, we tend to kind of focus a little bit more on savings because we are uncertain about what the future is going to bring, uncertain about whether we're going to have a job, whether we're going to have the business levels sustaining at the same level, etc. So we're going to put a little bit more of our attention to our savings. We certainly will cut down on discretionary spending. So if you're eating out once a week, you'll probably eat out once in a fortnight or maybe once in a month. Except for the topmost income layer, and even there, I would say, negative sentiment has an impact on how we spend. And that's something which we need to be concerned about. It starts to impact also essentials. You might, instead of buying 10 shirts, you might buy 6 shirts, and that's a 40% reduction. It's not as if you needed 10 shirts before and you need 6 shirts now. It's a discretionary decision to reduce your spending. Why are we talking about all of this? So I thought an iceberg was a useful analogy. This is a mice eye view as opposed to a bird's eye view of the economy. For event managers, for event organizers, for the conference industry, the consumption or the consumer part of the economy is only the tip of the iceberg, because it's what is visible, but what lies below it is the upstream B2B activities. So let's take the example of food. A quick service restaurant or a food retailer is the most visible form in our economy. But what lies behind that are the food manufacturers, are the food processing units, are the agricultural firms, the farmers, and behind them are the fertilizer company, the seed company, the irrigation technology company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this huge ecosystem which kind of sits underneath what's visible, which is the consumption segment. And below that is policy. Given that event organizers are engaged with so many other parts substantially of the economy, policy is an important part where you have a role, at least, to provide inputs into policy, if not influence it in some form or the other. This was a chart by The Economist putting in perspective populations of different Indian states and comparing them to some of the other countries in the world. And that gives you some sense, especially to the overseas delegates who've not been engaged with India so deeply, perhaps, as to what the scale of the country is. When you look at each state, it's like a country. It's also like a country in another way. If you look at the European Union, and again, this is a map of the EU with the map of India superimposed on it. It's funny, actually. It's a little amusing, but it's not when it comes down to it, when you actually get to executing it. Nobody says, we're going to launch in the EU, any business, branded, unbranded, whatever. They talk about launching in the UK, they talk about launching in France, they talk about launching in Spain or Italy or wherever, Germany. Nobody talks about launching in the EU. But people very casually say we're launching in India. It's a continent, and it is many countries in one. The diversity which India has parallels or even outstrips the EU, and the complexity that it creates is immense. Food, for instance, I mean, we are sitting in Bangalore. You can, within Bangalore, get a flavor of diverse food habits from around the country, and you have certainly Kannadigas from Karnataka, but also Maharashtrians, Punjabis, Gujaratis, Bengalis, Tamilians, etc., etc. And they're very distinct cultures in themselves, with food habits being very different. If you look at it from another perspective, the gender ratio, across the country, it's not one common standard due to various reasons, but the gender diversity in India is humongous. The gender ratio is quite diverse across the country, which has implications when you're looking at consumer products, which has implications when you're looking at services, when you're looking at even governance for that matter. This is another one which is not really consumer driven, but there are implications for consumer as well. It's essentially looking at where electrification, rural electrification has gone into in India, but the other map next to it shows where there is insolation, the incident insolation, solar energy falling on the surface of the earth. Income, India is not as unequal on Gini coefficient and other measures as some of the other countries are, even some of the more developed countries are, but certainly there are significant inequalities in income. The top end of the population is very much a global consumer, middle class, upper middle class to wealthy, whose spending habits, spending capabilities are certainly comparable to Western Europe, the US, some of the more developed East Asian nations as well. And that number is growing significantly. However, it's not as large as what many management consulting firms and planners like to think about. But there is a very large population underneath that, which is, again, growing significantly. And that's a consuming class which requires to be dealt with slightly differently. But that's a very important part of India's consumption and growth engine that I talked about, the consumption-led growth engine. If you look at income segments across the population, both urban and rural, you'll find this is, what is the ratio of food and non-food purchase in the consumption basket. You find that the non-food proportion of consumption actually goes up significantly. It's something which we would intuitively understand, but the impact of that, if you look at it, the non-food actually goes up from 40% or less than that to almost 60% of the total consumption. And when you translate that into the amount of money which that consumer has to spend, it's even larger per capita. So there is that diversity which is playing out as well. You talk about age, India is commonly talked about as a young economy. And sure enough, the median age is under 30 for at least the next maybe 10, 15 years, which is a significant advantage because you've got a young population which is eager to work, which is going to spend that money into creating households, into creating discretionary spends, which are going to obviously drive the economy in a different way. However, let's not forget the top of that graph. There were about 82 million people who were above the age of 60 in 2003, and that will double in the next 10, 15 years. And that consumer, 180 million people roughly, which is half of the US population, they have very different needs from the young population. So if we are only going to look at what the young need and how the young are leading their life, we're going to miss out this humongous opportunity as well as the need for looking after basics as well as discretionary needs of older consumers. There is another major shift which is happening, which is urbanization. Depending on which statistic you pick up and which source of statistic you pick up, there are anywhere between 50 to 55 cities with a million plus population, depending on how you demarcate. But that itself is going to go up to more than 60, which means there's a significant amount of concentration of population and income and spending which is happening. And these are both existing cities as well as new cities, new townships, which are coming up along the conurbation of existing cities. There are 355 districts with more than 1 million population, which are rural, which are not cities. And these are concentrations as well. We think about consumption-related growth as being driven by modern retail. And that's only, again, part of the story. This graph actually shows you two things. One is the number of malls, shopping centers, which are existing in different cities. The second thing is the spending index. And you can see it is correlated to a certain extent, but it's not 100% correlated. In some cases, there are more malls, but the city is actually lower down on the spending index than others. In some cases, the malls are fewer, but on the spending index, the city actually does better, which means that it's not just modern retail which drives consumption. It's not modern retail alone which actually drives consumer behavior. Another example, foreign companies stepping in with investments, generating interest, et cetera, et cetera. This graph shows you the number of foreign fashion and lifestyle brands which are operating in the country since the late 80s. And you can see that graph, ramp up only a little bit in the 90s, but after that, since 2005 onwards or 2004 onwards, there's this huge ramp up because there's been a lot of interest created. India has reached a critical mass for a lot of the companies that are interested in India. India is there at the cusp of being interesting, perhaps. Many of them have formed franchise relationships. However, the economy has not grown like this. Consumption has not grown like this. So it's not the foreign retailers, the foreign brands which are driving that. They are stepping onto a moving engine which is picking up pace. So all of this kind of was just a taster, if you like, of the diversity and the different aspects of the consumer economy in India. What it means and why is it important? One of the ways a business can respond to uncertainty is by being nimble, is by being flexible, is by being agile. So you have a change in the environment, you can shift your business model very quickly to be able to either use or defend yourself against the change. Better still, if you could anticipate those changes, you would be able to plan. And I think given the fact that we're talking about the event management and the conference organizing industry here, given that lead times are fairly long when you're planning an event, sector-specific event, for instance, when you're putting together exhibitors, when you're putting together speakers for a conference, etc., you're planning at least a few months in advance, if not more than a year in advance. If you can anticipate some of these changes that are happening, it gives you that extra time to be able to structure your business, to be able to structure the initiative, the specific conference better, maybe size it more appropriately, maybe price it appropriately, right? There's yet another layer to that, which is we can use the fact that we are engaged as an event organization in creating ecosystems potentially. We could shape the events and the changes. We could trigger the events. If we would look, analyze, put it together and say, okay, what does this mean? Where is the opportunity or where are the problems? You know, the events industry is dependent on infrastructure, and infrastructure is, expensive in this high capital cost economy that we have, this country. You want to plan infrastructure well in advance, obviously. We are constantly short of infrastructure. It's always later than it should be, etc. So if we could actually anticipate some of the changes, or even think about triggering, shaping those changes as they're happening, the infrastructure could be planned well in advance. We have the possibility of actually creating industry segments. India is a country, second largest country by population, huge numbers of people, 10, 12 million people get added to the workforce every year. Not all of them are getting employment. They will not, because there aren't enough jobs. So they're going to become entrepreneurs, like it or not. Because if you're not going to get a job in a large company or a small company, you have to do something to earn your living. You will be an entrepreneur. How about if we give platforms for those entrepreneurial opportunities to actually aggregate to create new industry segments? So the key takeaways that I would summarize from what I've spoken about so far. Number one, private consumption is a very, very significant contributor to the economic engine. We should remember that, use it to our advantage if we can. Secondly, sustained growth is where we are at, not sudden changes. But remember, the power of compounding is very, very powerful. Every year, 5% addition, 10% addition means a humongous amount at the end of 10 years. And that's what is happening in the Indian economy. The third thing is that there are developments happening across segments of usage or needs. India is not a monoculture. The Indian economy is not developing along one path. If we were to look at media, if you were to kind of look at the media channels or read newspapers or whatever, there is always an industry which is favorite. You know, IT at one point of time, BPO at another point of time, etc. But there is development happening across the spectrum. And there are opportunities across the spectrum. And we can create further opportunities across the spectrum for different industry segments, for different consumer segments, and for different segments which support those consumer segments. So some significant pointers that I thought would be worth summarizing again for this group here. Number one, the country is fairly diverse. The needs, the wants, the infrastructures are fairly fragmented. It's not as if we have humongous masses of consumption and industry which are aligned to each other in a few places. They're spread all across the country, which is, as an event organizer, as a conference organizer, you can see what's happened in the last 4 to 5 years. The number of events that are happening across the country, being organized by different people for perhaps the same industry segment. I could take textiles. The number of textiles events, or the number of retail events that happen across the country, or the number of food processing events that happen across the country. Cold chain. It's just enormous. It's just exploding. Are all of them doing well? No. But most of them are sustaining themselves. Some of them are doing very well. But the fact is, as an event organizer, and if you are interested in looking at the national picture, then you've got to keep in mind the fact that there is enormous diversity across the country and the needs are fragmented. Secondly, there are commonalities across the geography, which can provide some sort of a aggregate scale at the top, which could be used, and this is important from the point of view of how we structure the business and how we address the business model part of it in the events and the conference space. And thirdly, I would say this is probably the most important, and it addresses what I was talking about, shaping the ecosystem. Taking an authoritative position allows you actually much more price flexibility. It allows you to build scale. But to do that, you need to be capable and willing to take the position that I will evolve an ecosystem for, let's say, a particular industry segment. I will take that leading role. And that requires more forward thinking. It's not just about selling space. It's not just about selling the number of chairs in the room. It actually is about the content. It's actually about who's participating, who is being encouraged to participate, and some of them you've got to really maybe change their thinking a little bit. And there are event organizers in the country, I think, who are able to do that, who are taking that position and saying, there is an opportunity, it's not right now, it's going to be 4 years down the line, 5 years down the line, but I can be part of actually shaping the pipeline for that opportunity, for that industry segment, for that need segment. I'll just leave you with a picture, and this is again, India is supposed to be an IT superpower, etc. We're getting there slowly. The same applies to the conference and events industry as well. I think there's plenty which has happened. There's plenty yet to happen, and I think if we can keep our ears and eyes open, the consumption economy is something where we can find some useful pointers, tips, which could be useful for us to shape our businesses. Thank you very much.